Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
Hello and welcome to a very special episode we're recording today. I'm delighted to be joined by Arik Agassi, who is the CEO and Head of Global Partnership for Impact-SE. Thank you so much, Arik, for taking your time and speaking with us. So let's start with a little basic about the specific allegations made by Israel against the UNRWA members and employees regarding the involvement in the October 7 attacks. If you could share a little bit with that.
Sure, of course. So first, for background, Impact-SE, the Institute for Monitoring Peace and Cultural Tolerance in School Education, we're a research institute, a think tank that looks at education around the region for over 25 years. And we've been focusing on UNRWA for over 20 years in terms of the education and specifically the textbooks in their schools. And what has emerged over the weekend is what we have been warning many donor nations to UNRWA for many, many years about the results of this education, which is indoctrinating children to violence, to jihad, to anti-Semitism, to carrying out acts of killing. And we've seen this play out in October 7th. And what was revealed during the weekend was that many UNRWA employees that were current employees, mostly teachers and educators in school, held positions in parallel with recognized paragroups by the international community, such as Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, people who crossed over into Israel, who burned civilians alive, who beheaded children, who kidnapped the elderly, and butchered many, many people who, on their day-to-day lives, are teachers in front of children.
And before I move on to the specific case, I want to backtrack a little bit to the report Impact-SE wrote on UNRWA education textbooks in terror. And based on that, I wanted to understand, could you elaborate on the content of the Palestinian Authority, National Authority curriculum taught in the schools, specifically regarding the accusations of anti-Semitism, encouragement of violence, and jihadist ideologies? Like what we saw on October 7, in practice, it was taught in the school curriculums, right?
Exactly, yes. The Palestinian Authority is the body that produces this material, which is used all across the Palestinian territories. It's used by Hamas schools in Gaza. It's used by UNRWA schools all over in Gaza and the West Bank. And it's used by Palestinian Authority schools. Now, in these textbooks that UNRWA decides to use on their own, nobody forced them to use this curriculum. They made a deliberate choice to teach these materials. They could have taught something else. Is direct examples that we've seen play out in October 7th. There's an example of describing a burning bus with civilians in it as a barbecue party. And obviously, Israelis were burned alive in their homes on October 7th. There's another example of praising cutting the necks of the enemy, which is exactly what the Hamas terrorists, many of which graduated from UNRWA schools, did on October 7th. There are examples that teach that Jews, are anti-Semitic examples that Jews control the world. Stuff like Nazi Germany used to say against Jews, demonizing Jews generally as a people, as a collective, regardless of Israel. And all of that was taught to over 50% of the students in Gaza who go to UNRWA schools. Over 50% go to United Nations schools. So if about 3,000 terrorists crossed over into Israel on October 7th, it's safe to assume that statistically, at least half of them were graduates of the UNRWA school system that taught this hate. And what we heard over the weekend is not only that they're graduates, but actual employees as well.
And when we talk about this education system, could you specify the percentage of the budget of UNRWA being allocated to education, and how many students are we talking about being educated in the schools in the Gaza Strip?
Right. So UNRWA's main budget goes to education, about 60% of its budget. So most of the money that's coming in goes to salaries of teachers, building of schools that teach hate. And in Gaza, I think there's about just over 300,000 students at any given moment that go through UNRWA schools, just around above 50%, like I said before. And the rest go to Hamas-run schools that up to 2007, before Hamas took over, were regular Palestinian Authority schools with mostly the same staff, but it's just a different regime.
And if we move from there, I wanted to understand for our audience, because when we have education system and UN-run schools, there is a necessity to ensure that there is an adherence to UN values and standards. How does this curriculum or the content even adhere to the UN values and standards?
So UNRWA gives assurances to donor nations such as India without providing proof that they adhere to UN values, these textbooks. What they say without providing any proof, and people just take this for granted and our reports show otherwise, is that when students are faced with problematic content that does not meet UN values, UNRWA provides some kind of guidance to teachers to teach the content differently. But that's a very low bar of education, even though there's no evidence that this happens in Hamas-run Gaza. But let's say it does. Children are still exposed to the hate at any given moment in the hard copy textbook. So we're gonna testify tomorrow at the U.S. Congress, who's the largest donor to UNRWA, on evidence that we've shown of hate teaching. And what we're going to show is actual hard copies of the textbooks teaching, for instance, reading comprehension for 5th grade through a chapter glorifying terrorists who killed civilians, such as Dalal Mughrabi, who killed 38 Israeli civilians, including 13 children on a bus, as she's taught as a role model for children. And we're going to show this in the hard copy textbook. So imagine that UNRWA is basically telling, for instance, the Indian government that, the children see this chapter, they're visually exposed to it, but in some world, the teacher is telling them something else about it. So the children still go home with this chapter, they see it in class, they see it at home, and they're still taught about it. And it goes even worse, because our previous reports before November that you just spoke about relating to UNRWA education show that UNRWA education departments as a whole also produce their own self-created UNRWA branded materials that they created themselves, not by the PA, that they supplement the Palestinian curriculum, but they're created by teachers and principals and staff, and sometimes they're worse than even the textbooks. So the problem is systematic in terms of the hate education in these textbooks, and there is zero proof that UNRWA provides that it teaches this differently. To the contrary, UNRWA should be proud if they teach something differently, or they skip a page or something like that. They should show, donor nations, hey, we don't teach this chapter. We teach about Mahatma Gandhi, who supported peace and tolerance. And they refuse to provide any of this evidence. And this is something that the U.S. Government Accountability Office reported on back in 2019, saying that the State Department, blaming the State Department for taking UNRWA's word for face value without checking if they actually say what they do. So that is the biggest problem with saying that the textbooks adhere to UNESCO or to UN values, but in practice, this is not happening.
And one of the challenges even we face is to directly correlate violence actually to our textbook material. And there is a classic case for this particular example where we see in October 7th a lot of people around, of course, it's been alleged that 12 or 13 members are involved, but there were also proofs that over 1,200 people were actually associated with Hamas in some sort of a way. Uh, what you are testifying tomorrow is a classic example that a textbook that's been taught was actually followed book by book, page by page while carrying out attacks, because exactly that's how the mindsets of people were who were carrying out the attacks, right, on October 7th.
Yes, that is correct. I mean, textbooks can be political predictors, and they have the power to either radicalize or be a barrier to radicalization. And we've been, ringing the alarm bells for years on this, saying that this is what's going to happen if this education is not going to change. And Hamas can be eliminated to its core until the last gunman, but if you don't change the education that these terrorists grew up on, you're going to get another October 7th or another version of Hamas in a very short period of time. So education is key for regional stability and to prevent this from happening again. What happened before October 7th in terms of education cannot continue, and a new curriculum needs to be produced.
And while I was reading the report, it mentions of the review of the self-produced materials by the UNRWA after the supposed 2020 November internal review. Were there any changes, and what were the findings of the review, and how did the UNRWA address the issues raised?
Oh, well, the internal review, they never publish any results of their internal review. They claim that they've addressed the issue without providing evidence. But our reports of their self-created material that have UNRWA's logo on it were really, really bad. We've seen these materials supposed to supplement the textbooks, but what we've seen in practice is education departments basically creating worse materials sometimes, or the same materials in relation to the PA textbooks, instead of skipping the hate or teaching peace and tolerance, because UNRWA says that it has supplementary material to kind of address these issues and supplement to make the curriculum meet UN values. But in practice, it's exactly the opposite. They use their ability to self-create their own materials to keep the indoctrination.
The last thing I wanted to understand, because India is also one of the donor countries, so how has this fallout of this allegation impacted the organization itself, the UNRWA, especially in terms of funding and support from donor countries? And where do you see the potential consequences would be? Because even yesterday, I've seen a lot of tweets supporting UNRWA because of the alleged mention that only 12 members are involved and you still need it for the humanitarian relief efforts in Gaza.
Thank you for the question. It's an important question. Listen, giving people aid in need and in crisis scenarios is extremely important. But the reality is that in terms of the education, UNRWA's education program is not fit for purpose. Its program itself. And UNRWA has stated, obviously, that this would affect many lives, these funding freezes. But in practice, and people are not aware of this, unfortunately, UNRWA is doing a very bad job on the humanitarian side. They are not fit for delivering aid, and there are alternatives to do this. If UNRWA shuts down tomorrow, it doesn't mean that people are going to starve. The UN has a cluster system, it's called, that's implemented everywhere else in the world when there's a crisis management scenario, if it's an earthquake or a disaster or war. This was in Syria and East Timor and other places where different UN agencies come in and provide the relative assistance. UNRWA itself, if you think about it, most of its staffers out of 12,000 in Gaza are either teachers, doctors, or social service members. There's no real people who know how to deal with logistics, how to literally deliver the aids. That is not their expertise. They are not an aid delivery of food and things like that. And evidence of this is that even on Saturdays, UNRWA asked Israel to close the border and not to deliver aid because they couldn't cope with all the amount of trucks logistically. I heard also even that they had to hire or to find someone to, know how to operate a forklift to do this. They do not have the expertise on the ground to deliver the aid. They're doing a bad job. The aid is not getting to the people. And UNRWA is part of the problem with this. The aid is taken by Hamas. UNRWA is not able to logistically distribute the aid as it needs to do, like other UN organizations. And a lot of people are in need in Gaza, and they're in need of good services, which UNRWA is failing them, both on the education side and the humanitarian side. And UNHCR can provide shelter, UNICEF can provide education, OCHA, another UN body, can coordinate all of this. This can happen tomorrow, not in 10 days time, not in 6 months time or something like that. And like I said, in terms of the education, which is what we're focused on, it's not fit for purpose. It needs to be replaced. Someone else needs to do the education. And the funding freezes right now are a signal to UNRWA and to the international community as a whole that it needs to be replaced with something that will do better for Palestinians as a whole.
And why did it take for the UNRWA to actually acknowledge, or these were all being done under the same banner of the United Nations, promotion of anti-Semitism, encouragement of violence, and jihadist ideologies been propagated all through the banner of UNRWA? And why didn't they get to know about this before? They have been functioning for a pretty long time. They have been here for 1950s.
Well, listen, what can I tell you? October 7th woke a lot of people up and made people realize what they didn't know before. And a lot of people were caught by surprise. Some were not. We on the education side kept ringing the bells, like I said. UNRWA did not do any of this, did not address any of these allegations before. They kept blaming the messenger and mostly did not want to rock their boat, that they felt it's too politically sensitive for them. And this is the result. If you don't act, this is what will happen.
Well, that's all the questions that I had. Thank you so much for taking the time and speaking to us.
Great, really great questions.